All right, so this set of notes is going to cover the League of Nations and the mandate system, the international organization, and some of its policies that are put into place after World War I, as well as the global impacts of the Great Depression on mostly on the European scale. So the League of Nations, which we talk about a little bit in the notes previously, it's an international organization. Its entire concept was in order to prevent future conflicts, prevent future wars. That's why it's created by the international community. You can see that the United States doesn't belong to the United Nations, to the League of Nations. There is some debate between President Woodrow Wilson and the Senate as part of the checks and balances system, where despite the fact that Woodrow Wilson, here he is, created the League of Nations in his 14 points plan, you can see based on this political cartoon that people thought that he was being an idealist. People thought that it was not going to work anyway. And there were several people, including Senator Lodge, who spoke out against the United States joining an organization that could put our troops and our resources and our finances into jeopardy with international conflicts that we didn't actually deal with. Another political cartoon, I made it bigger just a few minutes ago. You can see on the snake it says international strife, which means like international conflict, and the bunny is the League of Nations. So just keep in mind that, like, obviously that snake is going to eat that bunny, and so the creator of this political cartoon obviously doesn't think that the League of Nations is going to function either. So ultimately, the League of Nations is going to be a drastic failure. It's never given any real actual authority, unlike the way the United Nations functions today, but we'll talk about that when we talk about World War II. But so since it doesn't have any power, it doesn't have any ability to stop anything from actually happening, obviously we end up with like the rise of Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini in Italy and the problems of World War II, all of which the League of Nations was supposed to stop, but it wasn't given any ability to do so. But just to bring this up to the front for you for a second so you can see how, that's not what I'm going to do, how powerful the League of Nations itself is. So any of these Navy countries, like the British Empire, so Canada, India, Australia, South Africa, as well as Great Britain, were all in the League from its entirety. This bright blue, which appears to be just Yugoslavia, as well as the neon green of, say, South America, Italy to Spain, Greenland, which is part of Denmark, which is also, you can see it over there, Japan, the Koreas. Those are all founding members, so all initial signers of the League of Nations, but ultimately who leave because it's not functioning or they're not happy with the way it's being run. All the other colors are either colonies, mandates, which essentially were colonies, or non-members ever. So all the gray, like the United States and say Saudi Arabia, are like never join in and say like it's not worth our time. So I mentioned mandates when we looked at that last map. So when World War I finishes and Great Britain and France are sort of the main two victors, obviously Russia and the United States as well. But when Great Britain and France are developing the League of Nations together, they take up large parts of the Ottoman Empire, as well as all the German colonies in Africa. But the ones we're concerned about are Ottoman Empire colonies. They take them and they give specific ones to France and specific ones to Britain, so Iraq, Transjordan, and Palestine versus Syria and Lebanon. And they're basically governed as colonies. So you can see like all of this section of the Middle East here. They're governed as mandates. They're essentially colonies. Except the point of a colony, if you recall, is to make money for the mother country. So the mother country can be self-sufficient, whereas the mandate system, they weren't actually supposed to be like permanently governed by Britain or France. Britain and France were supposed to develop within these regions, within these countries, governments, democratic-based governments, and then prep them for independence as independent Palestine, independent Iraq, etc. Unfortunately, that doesn't actually happen. And what falls into place is that the British and the French sort of abandoned these areas post-World War II. And these artificial boundaries that were drawn during the League of Nations time period lump together tribal groups that have been in conflict and that sort of thing. So it leads to a lot of the problems of like modern Middle Eastern policy. All right, total change of subject, just change in color. The Great Depression, which you probably remember from learning about in middle school. There is a lot of prosperity post-World War I, specifically in the United States, but also in industrialized countries in Europe after the rebuild. It's called the Roaring Twenties, right, where you have a lot of spending and a lot of excitement about the economic growth. And ultimately, there's going to be a crash. There's going to be a fall, as there always is. There are rises and falls in economic history that take several years to a decade or two to sort of sort themselves out and they come back. But it's going to lead. It's important to know in world history that it's not just an American problem, because in U.S. history we talk about how it impacts the United States, and we talk about the Dust Bowl, and we talk about unemployment and stock market crash. But it's also something happening completely around the world. I'm not really sure why there's two of this exact same picture here, but you can see that this is a line of people lining up for coffee. This is a woman and her children. These are people looking for jobs, and they list their qualifications. But I think this particular one is the most powerful. If you notice the sign, it says children are for sale and inquire within. So this woman's not obviously selling her children into slavery, but she's actually hiring out these little kids, these elementary school or preschool kids, to do specific jobs in order to make money, because they don't have enough money to feed their families. It's a very, very, very dire situation for a lot of people. So the causes of the Great Depression, we start up here with German reparations. Reparations, if you recall from your Treaty of Versailles information, are war damages payments. They were paid largely to Britain and France because of the destruction of the German military in Britain and in France. There's also an expansion of U.S. production, and this is supposed to be in the global, not the global, obviously, in the global economy. And this is because U.S. factories survived the war. European factories got destroyed. They got bombed out, and they got destroyed in the aftermath of or during the actual battles, whereas United States factories aren't attacked. So our industrial system is still able to grow, and because we're developing all these goods that are being sold to the rest of the world. When our economy starts to tank, it tanks everyone else's economies as well. You also have high protective tariffs. Tariffs are taxes on imported goods. So these are generally put in place. We've actually heard a lot about them in the news in the 2018-2019 time frame, because we're talking about when you bring in goods from other countries, if you tax them, it makes foreign-produced goods more expensive and less appealing, right? Whereas, you're basically trying to put your goods, people buy, American-made stuff instead of buying Chinese-made stuff. Well, the problem is that in the Great Depression, European countries, when their economies were falling, put taxes on the goods they were bringing in, and in retaliation, no one ended up trading at all with anyone, so the economy couldn't grow because it was getting too expensive based on taxes. There's also excessive expansion of credit. So this is when people are overusing credit. So they're buying things that they can't afford and that they also can never pay back. Sort of the biggest example of this is in relationship to the stock market crash in 1929. And it's that people were buying stocks with money they didn't have. They were buying stocks on credit. And then, in theory, so you buy the stock at a low price and the stock price rises, and then you sell it, and you would pay back your loan based on the profits that you made. Well, when you've bought all your stocks on credit and then the stock prices plummet, you now have to take a loan out to sell your stocks because your stocks aren't selling for very much. And then also you have a loan to pay back. So that's really what causes part of the stock market crash, is that when it started crashing, people couldn't do anything about it anyway. So they're going bankrupt because they already don't have the money to pay for the stocks they have. And this happened, across the country to people who were invested in the stock market. Massive impacts of the Great Depression. Start here with high unemployment in industrial countries. We talked about unemployment being high in the United States over the last sort of decade, where unemployment was about 8% of the population, and in the Great Depression it was 25%. So 1 in 4, some numbers as high as 30% of the population in the United States actively could not find a job. And that's massive when you're talking about like entire families that are trying to find work, and there is no work for anyone. There are bank failures. So the problem with bank failures is that people would put their money in the bank, right? And then the bank loans that money out. That's how banks make money, right? Is they take the money that I've invested and they loan it to the next person in line. And then as that person pays back the loan, the bank makes money on the interest. They're using my money to do that. Well, what happened is that people would do these, they called them runs on the bank. And basically what that meant is that like everyone would rush to the bank all at the same time in the same town and start withdrawing all their money. Well, when I take all mine out, and then Johnny takes all his out, and then Susie takes all hers out, when you get to a point, there is no more money left in the bank, and the bank could not then pay back people. So if you were at the back of the line, you got nothing, and the bank closed, and you lost everything you had. That's not something we can do that would happen anymore, because we have government-backed banks now with the FDIC. But at the time, it was happening everywhere. And, I mean, thousands of banks around the country were closing. There's also all the prices globally start collapsing because of this problem with the stock market and how the stock market was not working. And then the import taxes, the tariffs are all being instilled. No one's trading, so prices all collapse. The Nazi Party is going to emerge in Germany because the Nazi Party comes up promising to fix the Depression. That's genuinely what they campaign on, is that like they know how to fix the needs of Germany, and that's not actually the way that worked ultimately, but that's what they promised. And when you're looking at your kids not being fed, then you are looking to someone to fix that problem. One of the things that the Nazi Party does is that they blame the Jews in Germany for the economic collapse, because a lot of banking and financial industries are run by Jewish-run businesses because of like historical trend. And so the Nazis used that as a way to instill the initial hate of the Holocaust by blaming the Jews for all the problems of the economic system. It's false. It's flawed logic, and it actually is completely irrelevant that there are Jewish people running banks, but that's not necessary when you're instilling hate to have actual fact. This is a fairly famous picture where you have like, there's no way like the American way, like buy a car, look at your cute family. But what's in front of them is a bread line. So those people are all standing in line waiting for an allotment of bread from the federal government because they are starving. So there is no American way when people are starving. And then you have this picture, which I'll bring up to the front as well, where you have just a couple of little charts, right? So it talks about stock values and the collapse of prices in world trade, right? This is 1928, this is 1929, so you can see how much they were rising. When they're rising, this is radio, right, this green one. Radio stock prices rose from about $100 to $500 a share, and within a year. And then by the end of 1932, they had collapsed lower than they were when they started in 28. So you can see this like massive drop. We talked about failures of banks. 5,000 banks closed in the year 1933. So you can see it starts in 29, but it just gets steadily worse. And then here's the numbers for unemployment. So in 1929, it was only at 3.2. 1930, it was 8.2, which is in the last, say, decade. That's about the same rate that we were talking about. Like, it's the worst unemployment since the Great Depression. Well, it was at 8.2 in 1930. By 31, it was 15. And here in 33, it's, like I said, 25. So you can see that like, people are not able to get jobs to even get themselves out of the Great Depression. All right, so that's it. If you have any questions, let me know.